With a single heavy tap of my thumb, I initiated the transfer. Watching as my phone screen flashed with the cold confirmation 1, the transaction went through, leaving behind a mocking receipt. Transfer complete. The amount was exactly $1. I stared at that pathetic number before typing out a single devastating memo, "Congratulations." I pressed send. For nearly a full minute, I sat in the absolute silence of my kitchen, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock Mary and I bought 29 years ago. Outside Columbus, Ohio looked exactly the same as any other summer morning. A teenager jogged past, and Mr. Jenkins struggled with his boat. The world had not changed, but mine had. I picked up my phone. "Franklin Locksmith," I said calmly. "I need every lock on my house replaced today." I wanted every single entryway secured from the main entrance to the smallest side door. The dispatcher on the other end of the line hesitated, asking if I had lost my keys. "No," I replied. "I'm just worried someone made copies of them." My eyes drifted to the family photo hanging above our fireplace. "My daughter has a set," I explained, and the man quickly understood. I told him I also wanted a digital keypad installed. He said they could have a truck here within an hour, which was perfect. After hanging up, I slowly walked through the rooms one last time, while the old locks still belonged to our past. The front door, the kitchen, the sliding glass door facing the garden Mary and I planted before cancer took her. 3 hours later, the locksmith handed me 2 shiny brand new keys. "You are completely safe. Now nobody gets in unless you want them to," the locksmith told me before driving away. I nodded, knowing that was exactly the point. 20 minutes later, someone began pounding violently on my front door. "Dad?" I heard Emily shout. "What the hell is going on?" The brass handle rattled as she tried her key. "It is not working," she screamed, demanding I open up. Then her husband Brandon joined in, telling me to open the door. I walked slowly to the entryway, but stayed behind the closed door. "I can hear you," I said calmly. Emily asked what was wrong with me, and I told her nothing was wrong. When she complained about her key, I confessed that I had the locks changed. Her husband snapped that this was ridiculous, but I disagreed. This was long overdue. To me, this boundary was incredibly overdue, even as my daughter's voice grew increasingly frantic from the porch outside. "We just need to talk," she pleaded. But I reminded her that we had already bypassed plenty of chances to talk. She slammed her hand against the wood again, begging me to open it. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, closing my eyes, and whispered a single word: "No." Another 30 seconds of silence passed before I heard her murmuring to Brandon. He pulled out his phone, and 5 minutes later a police cruiser pulled into my gravel driveway. It was then that I realized how bizarre my life had become. 34 years ago, I had carried that baby girl into this exact house in a pink blanket from Riverside Hospital. Now she was calling the cops on me. Let me introduce myself. I am Richard Lawson, a 66-year-old retired electrician who spent 30 years working for the city of Columbus. My job was never glamorous, and it was certainly not the kind of career anyone would write a book about. I spent my days fixing traffic signals, repairing street lighting, and keeping the power running in government buildings, schools, and local libraries. I was never a wealthy man, and I never expected to be. But I slept soundly every night because every dollar I earned was made through honest, hard work. My late wife, Mary, who passed away 22 years ago from breast cancer, always joked that I could fix anything except my own coffee maker. When she died, our daughter Emily was only 12. I chose never to remarry so I could focus on her. During those early years of being a single father, I managed to burn more pancakes than I care to admit. I sat through countless dance recitals where I could not tell one routine from another, yet I always clapped louder than anyone in the auditorium. When boys eventually started calling our house, let us just say, I suddenly looked forward to answering the phone. Emily would laugh and accuse me of scaring them away, but I told her embarrassing her was just part of my job description. Back then, she would still wrap her arms around me. Money was tight and we skipped vacations for years while I drove beat-up trucks. I repaired old appliances instead of buying new ones. Also, Emily could graduate from Ohio State without a single dollar of student debt. Watching her graduate made me weep. Even though she saw me crying at her graduation, Emily pretended not to notice, and later she came over to wrap her arms around me. "We did it," she whispered. But I told her she was the one who did all the hard work. You and I both know how quickly a child's world can shift when someone new enters the picture. And for Emily, that was Brandon. At first, he seemed decent, wearing expensive suits and luxury watches. His family had serious wealth, with country club memberships and a lake house. The first time I met Brandon's mother, she looked around my modest dining room with that strained, polite smile people use when they are trying not to judge. "This home has character," she remarked. In response to her backhanded compliment, I just smiled and told her the house was filled with priceless memories. She nodded politely, murmuring that she supposed it was. Emily laughed along with them, and that quiet betrayal stung far deeper than I cared to admit. Over the next 2 years, the distance between my daughter and me began to widen. Our regular dinners stopped, birthday visits grew shorter, and Christmas became an Amazon gift card in the mail. Phone calls that used to last 30 minutes were cut down to a mere 3. I was never invited to any gatherings hosted by Brandon's wealthy parents, so eventually I stopped asking. Then one Sunday, Emily called to ask if she could come over. She arrived alone, sat at the kitchen table, and told me they were finalizing the wedding guest list. A cold knot tightened in my gut as I watched my daughter struggle to look me in the eye. She hesitated, stumbling over her words before whispering the sentence that broke my heart. "We do not think you should come to the wedding." I honestly thought my ears were playing tricks on me. She quickly claimed it was nothing personal, but to me, it felt incredibly personal. When she looked out the window and told me I would ruin the wedding photographs, I completely forgot how to breathe. I just stared at my only child across the same wooden kitchen table where she used to do her homework. I could still see the faint scratches from when she was 10 years old, carving her initials into the wood. Back then, I pretended to be angry, though Mary just laughed it off. Back when she was a little girl, Emily had wept bitterly because she genuinely believed I was angry with her. I had hugged her tightly before putting her to bed, telling her that some things are more valuable simply because they carry precious memories. Now I wondered if she remembered any of that. She whispered another apology, but I told her she was not truly sorry. When she insisted she was, I challenged her to tell me the real truth. I told her she was just giving me the edited, polite version of the story. She rubbed her forehead, sighing deeply, but I pressed her to stop protecting me from the reality of it. Finally, she admitted that Brandon's parents believed I would look entirely out of place at their elegant wedding. According to her, the guest list was packed with high society types from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. When I asked what exactly they were so worried about, Emily looked deeply embarrassed. She finally admitted they were terrified people would wonder who I was, and that they would never believe I was actually her father. I let out a dry laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so utterly unbelievable. That statement cut deeper than any physical blow, mostly because I realized she believed it too. I looked down at my rough hands. These were the hands that held hers when we crossed busy streets, the hands that built her childhood treehouse, and the hands that repaired her bicycle every single time she crashed. Those very hands had worked countless hours of overtime through the bitter Ohio winters, just so my daughter could enjoy summer camp with her friends. They were rough, scarred electrician's hands, not the elegant hands of a high society gentleman, and apparently, they did not belong in her perfect wedding photos. I softly told her that I had already bought a brand new suit last month. She looked stunned, asking when, and I explained I had planned to wear it to her wedding as a special surprise. The suit was still hanging in my closet, a beautiful, tailored navy blue set that was the finest clothing I had ever owned. When the salesman asked if it was for a funeral, I smiled and told him it was for my daughter's wedding. That navy blue suit would now likely hang in its dark garment bag for the rest of my days. Emily brushed away a tear, claiming she never wanted to hurt me, but I knew she just wanted to avoid being embarrassed. When she pleaded for my understanding, I folded my hands and asked her to explain. She told me Brandon's family was spending nearly $90,000 and inviting elite business partners. In their world, image is everything, and she quietly confirmed that I simply did not fit into that image. It was a simple, clean, and devastatingly painful truth. I stood up and walked to the window, staring at the old maple tree in the backyard. Have you ever had to watch the person you built your entire life around look you in the eye and choose a luxury image over you? Every single Saturday morning back then, my daughter Emily would find her way up into the branches of that old oak tree. One summer, she slipped from the very lowest limb, scraping her knees badly. I carried her inside while she sobbed, cleaned her cuts, and promised I would always catch her. That vow lasted my whole life, but apparently hers had expired. I asked if Brandon agreed with cutting me out of the wedding. She hesitated, saying he thought it was best to avoid tension. I nodded slowly, realizing her solution was to erase her own father. When I asked if her late mother would have been invited, she started crying, claiming that was different. I turned away, knowing her mother would have just looked better in the photographs. Hiding her face in her trembling hands, she let out a soft, broken whisper. "Dad," she murmured. I walked over, placing my hand on her shoulder, and told her she didn't have to explain anymore. I understood. She looked up with desperate hope, asking if I was angry. I told her no, which surprised her. I was heartbroken, but not angry. She grabbed my hand and said she was still my daughter. I told her she always would be. When she asked if we could move past this, I smiled and said that was up to her. I told her that one day her own children would teach her how every decision echoes far longer than we think. Before leaving, she said she hoped I would understand. I nodded, saying I already did. She smiled, relieved, thinking I had accepted it. Just because you accept something doesn't mean you ever truly forget it. The wedding took place 3 weeks later at a luxury country club outside Columbus. I did not go, obviously. Instead, I drove to Blendon Woods Metro Park early that morning, a quiet spot my late wife Mary loved. I sat on a bench by the lake for nearly 2 hours, watching families feed ducks. Seeing fathers teach their little girls how to skip stones made me smile. Life has strange timing. That evening, my neighbor Walter stopped by with a peach pie his wife had baked. He asked if I was doing okay, and even though I said I was fine, he knew better. We sat on the porch, eating in silence. Sometimes old friends know that silence is kinder than advice. My phone buzzed against the wooden coffee table late that night, breaking the silence. Someone had tagged Emily in wedding photographs online. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. There she was, beautiful and radiant, standing beside Brandon under strings of white lights. His family, his friends, even coworkers I'd never met were all there. Every important person in her new life was present except one. There wasn't an empty chair with my name, nor a place reserved for me that went unused. There wasn't any evidence I had ever existed. It was as though my daughter had edited me out of her life long before the photographer edited the pictures. I set my phone down, and for the first time since Mary died, I wept. My tears weren't loud or dramatic, but quiet, like a father mourning someone who was still breathing. 4 days passed with absolutely nothing. No phone calls, no apologies, not even a thank you for respecting her wishes. On the 5th morning, while watering the tomato plants in my backyard, my phone vibrated. It was Emily. For one foolish second, I smiled, thinking she had realized what she'd done and wanted to rebuild our bond. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened the message. It read, "Morning, Dad. We need $5,500 for our Dubai honeymoon. We came up a little short after the wedding. Could you help us out?" I stared at the screen, reading it twice. There was not a single word about her wedding. There wasn't a single word of apology, nor even a simple inquiry into how I was doing. Just another casual demand for cash. This time, something inside of me finally went quiet. I didn't reply right away. I just slipped my phone into my pocket and finished watering the tomatoes. I know that sounds strange. My daughter had just asked for $5,500 after excluding me from her wedding, and there I was tending to plants. But as you get older, you learn that reacting immediately usually makes things worse. My tomatoes needed water, but my anger didn't. After finishing up, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, enjoying the warm morning air. Over across the street, my neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, was busy washing his pickup truck while his little grandson sprayed more water on himself than on the tires. The boy couldn't have been older than 6. "Grandpa!" he shouted, holding up a tiny bluegill from our neighborhood pond. Mr. Jenkins dropped his sponge, walking over as if that fish weighed 50 pounds. Seeing the boy grin from ear to ear made me smile. Then I looked back at my phone. Emily's message sat there, with no greeting, no apology, and no acknowledgement that she'd erased me from her wedding day. Just a demand for $5,500. It's funny how a few blunt words can tell you everything you need to know about where you stand. Unlocking my phone, I opened up our entire text history instead of just looking at her latest message. It contained years of shared conversations, and I slowly scrolled upward. There were birthday wishes, photos of her dog, and questions about dinner recipes. The farther back I went, the warmer our bond felt. Dad, I got the job. Dad, thanks for helping me move. Dad, I miss Mom today. But then, right around the time Brandon entered her life, the tone changed. It became a list of transactional favors. Dad, can you loan us $800? Dad, could you co-sign this? Dad, can you watch the dog? Dad, we are short. It was always Dad, can you, or Dad, we need. I sat there scrolling, watching our bond dissolve into a series of demands. As I kept reading, a harsh realization made my stomach tighten into a hard knot. Over the previous 2 years, she had not once asked how I was doing. Not once. I wasn't a father to her anymore. I had quietly become a financial resource, a backup bank account, and an emergency fund. I wasn't even angry with Emily in that moment. I was angry with myself, because I had helped create this dynamic. Every single time she asked for money, I found an excuse to say yes, telling myself that young couples struggle. But I had forgotten that parents aren't supposed to finance their own disrespect. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Walter, asking if I wanted to grab lunch. I told him I was free, glad for the distraction. Within 30 minutes, Walter and I were sitting inside the cozy booth of a small local diner we had both frequented for nearly 20 years. The waitress knew us by name and didn't even have to ask what Walter wanted. After ordering my usual meatloaf, Walter leaned across the table and noted how tired I looked. Instead of answering, I handed him my phone. He read Emily's message, his eyebrows climbing. She actually sent this morning. No apology? He asked. I shook my head. He asked what I was going to do, and I admitted I didn't know. Walter shrugged and recalled his own dad's old words. If people only remember your number when they need money, they are not calling because they miss you. Walter's words about people only calling when they need money echoed in my mind all afternoon. Back home, I walked into the spare bedroom. Most folks would call it a guest room, but to me, it was still Emily's room, even though she moved out 10 years ago. Her old bookshelf stood in the corner, and the faded quilt Mary had sewn by hand still lay on the bed. Inside the closet were boxes she never took, filled with school trophies, dance shoes, and birthday cards I had written. On top of one box lay a framed crayon drawing of stick figures, a little girl and a tall man. Above us she had written, "My dad is my hero." I sat on the edge of the bed, holding that frame in my hands for 15 minutes, wondering where that sweet little girl had gone. I found myself wondering what had happened to that sweet little girl. Or perhaps more accurately, when I had stopped seeing the reality of the woman she had grown into. Late that afternoon, I drove to the bank just to buy myself some time to think. By the time I parked, my decision was made. I wasn't going to lecture Emily or send a long, emotional text listing my sacrifices. People know what they've done. They don't need a speech, they need consequences. I opened my banking app, initiated a transfer of exactly $1, and typed the memo, "Congratulations." My thumb hovered. Was I being petty? Then I remembered being excluded from my own daughter's wedding, realizing I wasn't even allowed to attend. With a firm tap of my thumb, I finally pressed send. A strange feeling washed over me. Not satisfaction or revenge, but pure relief. My next call wasn't to my daughter, but to Franklin Locksmith to get every single lock replaced. The locksmith asked why, and I explained my daughter had a key. He asked if I thought she'd come by, and I told him I knew she would and didn't want her inside. We scheduled an appointment for the morning. That evening, I drove to the cemetery to visit Mary. She had been gone for 22 years, but talking to her still felt natural. I placed white lilies by her headstone and whispered that she'd be disappointed in both of us. The difference was, she'd tell me to forgive. You and I both know how hard it is to finally draw a line. But a gentle wind was whispering through the old oak trees in my front yard that morning, carrying a quiet promise of a fresh start. The locksmith arrived right at 9, proving to be professional, efficient, and pleasant to talk to. In less than 2 hours, every lock in the house had been replaced, and I had a new security code for the garage keypad. I even threw away the old spare key that used to sit under the porch flower pot. After he left, handing me 2 fresh keys, I stood in my hallway and felt my home belonged to me again. It wasn't about shutting Emily out, but about stopping myself from being taken for granted. But at exactly 2:17 that afternoon, my phone buzzed as Emily and Brandon stepped onto my porch, smiling. Watching from the monitor, I saw Emily reach into her bag, pull out her old key, and confidently slide it into the lock. It didn't turn. She tried again, frowning, but the lock held firm. Looking up at the lens, she called out, "Dad!" When I didn't answer, she began to pound on the wood, her voice echoing through our quiet street. I stood in the foyer, my hand resting on the brand new brass doorknob as the sunlight gleamed off it. It was funny how a simple $200 lock felt more valuable to me than any of the expensive wedding centerpieces I had seen. Then Brandon started hammering, yelling, "Richard, I know you can hear us!" "I can hear you," I called back calmly through the wood, and the noise stopped as a sigh of relief escaped Emily. They clearly expected me to open the door, but I stood my ground, letting the heavy silence settle between us. Emily scoffed, telling me to stop acting up, but I calmly replied that I wasn't acting at all. She rattled the handle, complaining her key didn't work. "I know," I said. "I changed the locks." When she asked why, I took a deep breath and explained that those old keys belonged to a chapter of my life that was now closed. Brandon stepped up, calling me ridiculous, but I told him I was just setting boundaries. Emily laughed nervously, pleading that we were family. I shut my eyes, remembering the wedding guest list they had kept me off of. "You decided I didn't fit the image of your family," I said quietly, "so why does that suddenly matter to you today?" Neither of them had an answer. Emily tried a softer approach, suggesting they had only come by to talk. I reminded her she had already had plenty of chances. She sighed deeply, admitting they shouldn't have handled things the way they did. It was the closest thing to an apology I had heard, but it still was not one. When she hopefully asked to come inside for a few minutes, I simply said no. Brandon lost his temper, calling my behavior childish, which made me smile because I thought the same of him. He snapped about the single-dollar bill I had sent them. "It meant congratulations," I replied. Emily quickly cut off his brewing anger, pleading, "Dad, we really need that money." And there it was. No words of love, no remorse, just a desperate need for my checkbook. No words of affection came from her mouth, only talk of finances. It always came back to money. I unlocked the small side window next to the door, opening it just enough to speak. Emily looked exhausted, the glowing bride from the pictures completely gone, with heavy dark circles under her eyes. Brandon just looked incredibly annoyed. "Dad," Emily pleaded, "the honeymoon isn't fully paid for, and if we cancel now, we will lose our deposits." I told her I was sorry to hear that. She blinked, asking why I wouldn't help since I always had in the past. I nodded. "Helping someone and enabling them are two very different things," I said. She frowned, unable to grasp my meaning, while Brandon folded his arms in silent anger. "Let's stop pretending this is about money," Brandon muttered, and I agreed with him. He claimed I was just upset about the wedding, but I corrected him. I was heartbroken, and those are two very different things. If I were simply angry, time would heal it. Looking directly at Emily, I told her that her actions proved she was ashamed of me. She tried to protest, but I reminded her of her own excuse. She said I would ruin the photographs. It wasn't about me making a scene or getting drunk. She just didn't want my face in her picture-perfect memories. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes, her silence confirming everything. I quietly shut the small window, knowing our conversation was over. A second later, Brandon slammed his palm against the door in a fit of rage, calling the situation unbelievable. He pulled out his phone, threatening to call the police if I wouldn't listen to reason. Emily looked panicked, but Brandon insisted I couldn't lock them out. I almost laughed at his ignorance. Within 5 minutes, a Columbus police cruiser pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. Both looked experienced enough to spot a family drama from a mile away. The male officer approached Brandon first, asking what was going on. Brandon pointed at my house, complaining that his father-in-law had locked them out. The officer asked if Brandon lived here, then asked if Emily did. When she hesitated and said no, the officer looked completely puzzled. "So who actually owns this house?" the officer asked. Brandon pointed to the door, muttering that I did. The officer blinked, asking why exactly they had called the police. A gentle knock then sounded on my door, and I opened it just enough to speak. The female officer smiled politely, introducing herself as Officer Daniels, and asked to ask me a few questions. I agreed. She asked if the couple lived here, and I said no. She asked if they had permission to enter, and I replied, not anymore. I explained that my daughter used to have a key, but I had changed the locks that morning because I wanted control over who stepped into my home. She didn't write anything down. She simply nodded in understanding. Officer Daniels asked if there had been any threats or physical contact, and we both confirmed there was none. She thanked us, and the two officers stepped aside to speak privately for a moment. Walking back to Emily, Officer Daniels explained that I had not committed any crime. Emily looked stunned, arguing that she had always had a key. That doesn't establish residency, the officer replied. Brandon snapped that she was my daughter, but the officer calmly explained that being an adult child doesn't give you the legal right to enter someone's home. The male officer added that changing the locks is entirely within a homeowner's rights. Brandon's face turned red as he realized they had to leave. Emily looked as if she had been punched in the gut. She turned to me and whispered, "So you really don't want me here?" I met her eyes and told her that wasn't true. "You just proved it," she said. "No," I replied softly. "You proved something first." A single tear rolled down her cheek, and for the first time I saw genuine hurt in her eyes. It wasn't because she was angry. It was because she finally understood that actions have consequences. Before leaving, Officer Daniels walked back to me. In a whisper, she told me her own father hadn't spoken to her for 3 years when she was 25. "I thought I knew everything," she said with a sad smile. "I wish someone had taught me sooner that parents have hearts too." Tipping her hat, the officer wished me luck, and I told her I hoped things would work out too. I watched Emily and Brandon walk slowly back to their SUV. She climbed inside without another word. Brandon started the engine and they pulled away. I stood on my porch until the car disappeared around the corner and the neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm. Kids rode their bikes, a neighbor walked a golden retriever, and life simply went on. You and I both know how hard it is to move on, but that evening, as I sat on my back patio watching the sun sink behind the maple tree, I tried. The deep silence didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt completely honest. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my phone to ring with another demand. I had stopped worrying if I was doing enough, and I was no longer trying to buy a place in my own daughter's life. If Emily wanted me in her world, she would have to come to me as a daughter, not as a customer visiting a bank. 3 weeks passed by in absolute silence. No calls, no texts, no emails. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, a gentle knock sounded at my door. Looking through the peephole, I was shocked to see it wasn't Emily. Instead, Brandon's father, Charles Whitmore, stood on my porch in the damp air. We had only met twice before, once at the engagement dinner, and once after the rehearsal dinner I hadn't been invited to. I opened the door expecting an argument, but his presence caught me off guard. Charles looked different, far less polished than the man I remembered. His expensive navy blazer was wrinkled, and heavy dark circles hung beneath his tired eyes. "Mr. Lawson," he said softly, "I hope I am not intruding." I stepped aside and invited him in. He walked slowly, looking around, and remarked that my home felt comfortable. I smiled, mentioning that my wife always said a house should look lived in. He nodded, saying his wife would have agreed, which surprised me since I assumed they always agreed on everything. I poured us 2 hot cups of coffee, and we chatted about the weather, local traffic, and the Ohio State Buckeyes. Eventually, Charles set his mug down, looked at me, and said, "I owe you an apology." I just stared back at him. He looked at me with so much regret. "For what?" he asked. "For letting my family control your daughter's choices. I should have fought for her." I stared at him. "You knew?" Charles nodded, letting out a heavy sigh. He explained how his wife became consumed by appearances, the guest list, the flowers, the seating, and the photos. "Especially the pictures," he muttered. He had warned her not to hurt people, but she insisted. Guests forget the food and music, while photos last forever. I shook my head at the bitter irony. "They will remember this mess much longer," I whispered. Charles gave a tired smile, stood up to leave, and before walking out the door turned to tell me Emily still loved me. I did not answer. "She made a terrible mistake," Charles whispered. "I know," I replied, "but sometimes people confuse fitting into someone else's world with improving their own." He reached out to shake my hand, apologizing sincerely, and I returned the gesture. After he walked away, I stood by the door for a long time. His apology did not fix the past, but it proved to me that Brandon's family was not completely heartless. Sometimes the loudest voices simply drown out the wise ones. Within a month, my life settled into a quiet routine. Every Tuesday morning, I volunteered with Habitat for Humanity. I had always been good with tools, and they always needed a pair of hands. On my first job for a single mother, her oldest son watched me carefully install the new kitchen cabinets. "Have you built houses your whole life?" the boy asked. I laughed and told him I spent my career fixing electrical systems. He thought that was cool, while his little brother piped up to say their grandpa could fix anything. I smiled, letting him know I used to be able to do that too. The older boy asked to help, and for the next hour I taught him to measure twice before cutting once. His excitement reminded me of Emily when she was little, holding a flashlight in the garage while I fixed bicycles, proudly calling out that she was helping. Those memories still hurt, but they no longer ruled my life. Then one Friday, Walter called to tell me Emily and Brandon had canceled their honeymoon because they could not afford it. I leaned back, completely quiet. Walter kept talking, explaining that the wedding went way over budget and they lost their reservation in Dubai. I thanked him and hung up, sitting in the quiet room. To my surprise, I did not feel happy. A month ago, I might have felt vindicated, but now I just felt sad. Nobody wins when a family breaks apart. Over the next few weeks, rumors reached me through mutual friends. Brandon's company went through a restructuring and his expected bonus never came. The new furniture they had financed for their downtown condo suddenly became an expensive burden. Their credit card debt grew rapidly, causing frequent arguments where they blamed each other for everything. Then one evening, Walter called to share another piece of the puzzle. "My niece works with Emily," Walter told me, adding that she had been crying at her desk. I looked out my kitchen window, quietly saying I hope she is okay. Walter went silent before saying, "You still love her?" I replied that I always would. When he asked why I did not call, I smiled sadly, explaining that loving someone does not mean saving them from every consequence. Days later, my phone rang, showing Emily's name. I stared at the screen until it went quiet, leaving a voicemail. Over the next hour, she called twice more. For years, I had answered her immediately, but this time I waited. I did not want to punish her. I just needed to be sure I was not acting out of sheer guilt. That night, I finally listened to the message. "Dad," her voice whispered, sounding entirely exhausted. "I know you probably do not want to hear from me." There was a long pause, her voice cracking. "I found something today. I was cleaning out my old boxes at your house, and I found Mom's journals." That caught my attention. Mary had kept journals for years, and I had packed them away after her passing, unable to face reading them. Emily continued, saying there were letters inside addressed to her. I closed my eyes, realizing Mary had never told me about them. Emily was crying openly now. One of them says, "If your father ever seems too protective, remember he is trying to do the work of two parents with one broken heart." I felt my own eyes fill with tears. "Your father will never be perfect," Emily read, "but no one will ever love you more faithfully." The voicemail ended with her quiet sobbing. There was no request for money, no excuses, just tears. I sat in my living room holding the phone, realizing that for the first time since the wedding, my daughter actually understood what she had done. It was not because I changed the locks, or because the police came, or because her honeymoon was canceled. It was because her mother's words had reached a place my anger never could. 3 evenings later, just after sunset, the doorbell rang. There was no pounding or shouting. I looked through the peephole and saw Emily standing there, alone, without her designer purse, expensive jewelry, or styled hair. She looked exhausted and fragile. When I opened the door, she did not try to step inside, but simply stood on the porch, holding a small cardboard box. "I brought something," she whispered. "What is it?" I asked. She looked down. "Everything you ever gave me." Inside the box, I saw the spare house key, the emergency credit card, the garage opener, and the old family cell phone I had paid for years. She looked up, her eyes swollen from crying. "I do not want your money anymore," she said, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I just want my dad back." For the first time in weeks, I did not know what to say. Neither of us moved as she held that cardboard box as if it weighed 100 pounds. I looked at the contents again. The house key, the garage remote, the emergency credit card, a key to my old truck, and the laminated library card from when she was 8. She was not just returning things, she was giving back every privilege she had taken for granted. "I do not want your money anymore," she repeated. "I just want my dad back." I swallowed hard. "Come inside," I said. When she hesitated, I stepped aside. "You do not have to stand on the porch." She entered slowly, like a stranger. Maybe we both were. We sat at the kitchen table, the exact spot where she had previously sat to tell me I was uninvited to her wedding. This was the table where Mary helped her study, where we celebrated birthdays, good report cards, and ate Tuesday dinners. So much of our lives happened around this wood, yet we nearly lost each other here. I poured 2 cups of coffee. Emily held her mug but did not drink. "I am so sorry," she said. I waited, not to make her uncomfortable, but to let her speak fully. She shook her head. "No, sorry is not enough. I became someone Mom would have been ashamed of." I remained silent. She continued explaining that when Brandon proposed, she felt like she had finally made it. "What does that mean?" I asked. "I was constantly comparing my life to everyone else's," she said. "The perfect house, the perfect wedding, the perfect photos." She laughed bitterly. "I was trying to impress people who barely knew me, and I pushed away the only person who loved me when I had nothing." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper. "I brought this." It was one of Mary's letters, its edges worn from being opened so many times. She handed it to me, whispering that she read it every day. I opened it carefully. Mary's handwriting had not changed in 22 years. She wrote, "If you are reading this, it means I am not there to remind you of what is important. Never measure people by what they wear, earn, or what others think of them. Measure them by who stays beside you when life is hard." The letter continued. "If you ever choose between protecting someone's pride and your father's heart, choose your father." I stopped reading, my vision blurred by tears. Emily finished the line from memory, "Because no photograph will ever love you back." The room went silent. Mary wrote those words years before Emily met Brandon, yet she saw this coming. "I am not here to blame Brandon," Emily said. "He made mistakes, but so did I. I could have said no. I could have insisted you be there, but I did not." She wiped her eyes. "That is on me." I nodded. "Thank you." She looked surprised, asking for what? For not blaming everyone else. "It usually is," she agreed. Looking around, she murmured, "The house feels different." I nodded. "It is." "Did you redecorate?" I smiled. "No, I just stopped waiting." She frowned, asking what I meant. I explained how I spent years waiting for phone calls and invitations to feel important, but once I stopped, I started living. I told her about Habitat for Humanity, the boys, learning to measure Walter and Linda, and my quiet mornings in the garden. Emily listened silently. "I missed all of that," she whispered. "I am sorry." "I know." A few days later, Brandon called. I almost did not answer. "Mr. Lawson," he said. "It is Richard," I corrected. After a pause, he said, "I owe you an apology. I was arrogant." It took me a long time to realize that success has absolutely nothing to do with making a grand impression on other people. For years, I foolishly encouraged Emily to obsess over outward appearances when my real job should have been protecting her from that shallow mindset. When Brandon took responsibility by saying he instead of we, I felt a genuine flicker of respect. He admitted he was trying to be a better husband and a better son-in-law. I told him he would have to earn that title, but it wasn't a rejection, it was a quiet beginning. The next Sunday, Emily and I stood together by Mary's grave with fresh white lilies. As she knelt and wept, apologizing to her mother, I placed a hand on her shoulder, knowing the healing had finally started. Instead of heading straight back home, Emily quietly asked if we could make a quick detour. She did not want to go to a restaurant. She wanted to visit the old neighborhood park. The playground was completely renovated with shiny new swings and fresh wooden benches, but the massive oak tree, where I taught her to ride a bicycle, still stood tall. We laughed together through her tears about how she fell 6 times, 7 actually, because I counted everything back then. She told me she was trying to get back up again, and I said I was too. Over the next few months, trust slowly returned, one honest conversation at a time. She began coming over every Wednesday for dinner, sometimes with Brandon, and we never forced a single awkward word. We did not spend our time pretending that the past had never occurred. Instead, we talked openly about our work, our mistakes, about Mary, and about life. One afternoon, Emily handed me a wrapped package containing a framed photograph. It was not a polished wedding picture from an expensive studio, but an old snapshot I had completely forgotten about. In the photo, I was kneeling next to an 8-year-old Emily in our driveway, both of us covered in grease while fixing her bicycle, laughing. On the back, she had written that this was the family picture she should have been proud of all along. I do not mind admitting that I cried happy tears when I read that. When people ask if sending that $1 was about revenge, they are entirely wrong. Neither changing the locks nor setting those strict limits was driven by a desire for vengeance. Those were simply the boundaries we desperately needed. True revenge would have meant spending the rest of my life trying to make my daughter suffer. But I chose a much harder path. I gave her the chance to grow, and I gave myself permission to heal. Sometimes being a strong parent means having the courage to stop giving until respect is restored. If this story reminds you of someone you love, I hope you will reach out to them before pride builds a wall no locksmith can open. Remember that forgiveness always begins with absolute honesty, and love only grows strong when it is rooted in mutual respect. Thank you so much for listening.